A stronger day, be your best every day. Hi, I'm Dimas, founder and director of Strong Optimizer. I aim to help you stay healthy, be happier, and deal with challenges with greater resilience. Who are you? Are you thoughtful and reserved, or sociable and fun living? Or are you calm and confident, or anxious or pessimistic? Do you know that your personality is associated with your well being? Today, you will meet Dr. Reb Rebele. Reb will show you how your personality can shape and influence your well being. Thank you. Hi, I'm Dimas, founder and director of Strength Optimizer. Thank you for watching Strength Optimizer, the Size Up Your Wellbeing series. Today, we have Reb Rebele joining us. Reb is a senior research fellow for the Wharton People Analytics Institute at the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD candidate studying a personality process at the University of Melbourne. After completing his Master of Applied Positive Psychology, he worked on a diverse portfolios of positive psychology projects, including serving as part of the resilience training team, working with the US Army and groups of educators, speaking and guest lecturing on applied psychology topics to organizations and conferences, working as a strategic advisor to the International Positive Psychology Association. I'm so grateful to have you today, Reb. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me, Adimas.
No, it's just good. Look, once again, thank you for taking the time to share your research on how our personality relates to our well-being. So let's begin. Reb, again, your research focuses on how people regulate their personality in order to achieve different goals. Before we dive into your research, what is personality psychology and what are some common misconceptions about personality?
Sure. So it's a fairly big question to start, but personality within the domain of psychology is sort of really the study of individual people and what makes them them. And one framework I like for sort of distinguishing what is personality and what's not personality is that psychological constructs tend to be sort of associated with personality when they differ between people. So personality helps us understand individual differences between two different people, but also when they're consistent within individuals. So when we say somebody's extroverted, we don't just mean that they're being extroverted at this particular moment. We're sort of describing what they're like in general over time. So personality really sort of refers to those things that give each one of us consistency over time and also help to distinguish us from one another. And personality psychology is really sort of the discipline within psychology that tries to study those differences, but also the processes that lead to them and the processes that lead people to sometimes act consistently with their personality, sometimes not.
All right.
So that's sort of the intro to the field. I mean, I think in terms of misconceptions, I think probably some of the biggest ones are if you're familiar with the big 5 personality traits, sometimes people think that personality psychology is just the study of the big 5 traits, and it studies a lot more than that. And then I would say too is the sort of idea that personality is something that is fundamentally fixed, right? That it is part of who you are. It's a fundamental part of your nature, and there's no changing it, and you are always exactly one kind of person, right? So there's a personality type that you have, and you are always that type. And the data really just doesn't bear that out.
I see. It's good that you clarify that because it's something that we're going to dive deeper as well. And I think that when it comes to the world of personality, especially if it's popularized by what we call the pop psychology or psychology, there's literally thousands and millions of online personality tests. And as fascinating as interesting as they are, but in terms of the scientific validity, sometimes can be a little bit questionable. But I guess that in a nutshell, as human beings, we want to know ourselves, we want to know other people. And when you talk about personality, you talk about individual differences. And I guess that there's also perhaps another term of what makes us unique. But also there's also an element that personality may not necessarily be fixed, as a lot of people would believe that I'm born as an extrovert, I'm born as an introvert, therefore nothing else I can do. Therefore, you just have to take me as I am, bear with me kind of situation.
Yeah, And Brian Little, who's a famous, very influential personality psychologist, and I think he borrowed this phrase from somebody who came before him, but he sort of often says that personality covers the things that make us in some ways like everybody else, in some ways like some other people, and in some ways like no other person, right? So your personality in some ways connects you to sort of all people. In other ways, it connects you to certain other kinds of people, but not others. And then in some ways, your personality is very idiosyncratically you. It's the things that you uniquely care about and are interested in. So yeah, I think that's a helpful frame.
Thank you, thank you. And since we are talking about personality and well-being, I'm just wondering what personality traits tend to be associated with well-being, and how do you define well-being in your research?
Sure. So there's a lot of research on how personality relates to well-being, sort of going back decades now. And so it really, in a lot of ways, starts with the question of, well, are some kinds of people, right? Again, sort of keeping in mind that there aren't really kinds of people, but are some people with certain traits or values or characteristics, do those people tend to be happier or less happier than other people? And there's a great large meta-analysis put out last year, a sort of study of studies that found that some of the sort of common personality traits that are most strongly associated with well-being are things like extroversion. So being highly extroverted tends to be, people who score high on extroversion scales tend to score high on well-being measures. People who are low on neuroticism or high on what's called emotional stability. So people who tend not to be very anxious or tense or worried or reactive to situations, they tend to have higher well-being. And one that maybe people sometimes don't realize as much is conscientiousness. So conscientiousness is the tendency to be hardworking and organized, and people who score higher on that trait also tend to have higher well-being. And you asked sort of what kind of well-being are we talking about here? You know, in these studies, they use sort of two approaches. One was the notion of psychological well-being being life satisfaction, like a combination of high life satisfaction, high positive affect, so to what extent do you feel a lot of positive emotions, and low negative affect, to what extent do you feel few negative emotions. So that was one strand of the research. And then the other strand of the research used Carol Riff's idea of psychological well-being that was sort of more based on eudaimonic ideas of well-being. So things like personal growth and environmental mastery and autonomy and positive relationships with other people. So there's a lot of different constructs in there. And if you get into the weeds, some traits are more strongly associated with certain types of well-being than others. But in general, this stuff all tends to correlate a lot with each other.
I see. Okay. And I guess that perhaps for some of our viewers or listeners out there, so they hear about this word extraversions, and if you tend to score higher extraversion, you tend to higher level of well-being, and immediately, you know, we go to this mindset, oh, I'm not an extrovert, you know, I'm more the introvert in the sense that I like to ponder upon things, reflect upon things, and does mean that it's doom and gloom for me for the rest of my life. That's it. And either I have to pretend to be happy and loud and be a social butterfly, or I just have to accept the fact that yes, my well-being is always going to be lower.
Yeah, no. So it's not all doom and gloom for introverts, right? And
I'm one of them. That's
so
why I'm defending for myself.
Yeah, for sure. Likewise, right? Or I'd say I'm a bit of an ambivert, right? I like being extroverted sometimes and introverted at other times, and that's actually what a lot of my research is on. And I think that's one of the main messages I try to sort of send across, which is that, you know, personality, when you take a personality assessment, even if it's a really well validated one, like a good measure of the big 5 personality traits, it's a reflection of what you tend to do and what you tend to be like. But within each person, there's significant variability from one situation to the next. So even the most introverted people have some times where they tend to have their extroverted side come out a little bit more. And even highly extroverted people tend to have times where they're acting a little bit more introverted. And what some of the research shows is that even people who are dispositionally introverted, right? Like that's the way you tend to be, that's the way you like to be. For a lot of those people, their momentary happiness is highest when they're being extroverted. So even introverts tend to actually get a lot of positive emotions out of being in rewarding social situations. And At the same time, it can be a bit depleting, right? So there's some research by a couple of my colleagues, Luke Smiley, Rowan Jack Hamilton, and others on the sort of costs and benefits of acting extroverted when you are an introvert. And so when you are an introvert, if you try to act extroverted, it does seem to bring some benefits for your well-being, but it also tends to make you a little bit more tired, a little bit, feel a little bit less authentic. And so one of the sort of guides out there is, Brian Little talks about this idea of having restorative niches. So if you're somebody who, so if you're somebody who likes to be introverted, tends to be introverted, but you want to be extroverted in a particular situation because you're going to a family gathering and you want to actually catch up with people, or you have to go to a work function where you're going to have to be interacting with a lot of people. One of the things you can do is plan to have a restorative niche afterwards where you can sort of go be your introverted self, and it might be a little bit of a relief to know while you're at that party that you're not always going to be at parties, right? You're not always going to be stuck interacting with people. And it might make it easier to say, well, how can I bring out my extroverted side of myself right now? And that's really what a lot of my research is on, is finding that people want to bring out different aspects of their personality at different times, depending on the goals that they have. So if you are in a situation where you really want to connect with other people, most people seem to want to be more extroverted in those situations for a brief period of time. And that's a little bit different than saying, I want to become an extroverted person. So you can stay the introverted person that you are, but temporarily shift into an extroverted mode because it'll help you, do something that you value in that moment.
Exactly. And sounds like there's an element of choice, of agency in terms of being authentic as who you are, whether extrovert or introvert, but at the same time, depending to the goals, as mentioned earlier, the context and situation, it can be a short period of time that you can choose to be either introvert or extrovert if the goals aligns with the values in the particular context. And you talk about after that, there's also a choice that we can so-called retreat back to our comfort zone, or for me, my man's cave. Okay, I can actually have a little bit of relaxing moment to be who I am. So I'm just seeing that at times it could be a little bit of tensions of, yes, I want to be authentic who I am, but at the same time, I also need to regulate my preference, my tendency, my wants in order to accomplish certain goals. Is that a fair summary to say so?
Yeah, although I would say that authenticity is a bit of a tricky concept here, because what part of yourself are you being authentic to? Are you trying to be authentic to the version of you that you usually are, or are you trying to be authentic to your values, right? So you could have somebody, for example, who is, scores low on the trait assertiveness, right? So you tend not to be somebody who speaks up or challenges authority or something like that. And that same individual could be very high in benevolence values. So they really care about the well-being of other people. And you could imagine a situation where somebody sees an injustice, somebody like that sees an injustice happening. And all of a sudden, they're highly motivated to be assertive, which is inauthentic to the way that they usually are, but it is very authentic to their value, their consistent value of trying to help other people when they can. And so they might, in that moment, say, well, even though I'm not generally an assertive person, I am going to, it's actually perfectly authentic and consistent with who I am and my identity and my values to be assertive in this situation because it's serving a value or a goal that I really care about. So I think we have to be careful not to assume that just because somebody's behaving a little bit differently than they typically do, that's not necessarily inauthentic behavior. It could actually be coming from a very authentic and sincere motivation that is consistent. It's just they think in this particular situation, they need to behave a little bit differently than they usually do.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's so important because, again, authenticity can be interpreted in many shapes and forms, and these situations, you have to expand that. Yes, there's authenticity in terms of alignment of my preferences, but also there's so authenticity that can be aligned to my beliefs, my values, and my convictions, and that's also a form of authenticity.
That's right.
That's good. That's good. And also understand that your research tend to focus on personality states. So what are personality states, and why is understanding them important for understanding well-being?
Yeah, so this gets to sort of some of what we've been talking about this idea that, in any given situation or at any given moment, you might be, you could describe your behavior as relatively introverted or relatively extroverted. So personality state is basically taking the same constructs as personality traits, so things like extroversion, conscientiousness, or those kinds of traits, and saying, well, how extroverted are you being right now? Not how extroverted are you in general, that's a personality trait, but how extroverted are you being right now? Or how extroverted have you been in the past 30 minutes? And so these, whereas personality traits, what you're like in general, tends to be very stable over time. So somebody who is generally extroverted, if you surveyed them again a year later, they're probably still going to be generally more extroverted. Whereas personality states are much more variable, right? So each one of us, no matter where we score on a trait scale, our states tend to vary from one moment to the next. Not all over the place, there's consistency and those kinds of things, but these states really matter for our momentary well-being, right? So in the moment, like I was saying before, like let's say you're in a social situation and in that particular moment, you're feeling like you really want to connect with other people, well, then it would be probably quite helpful to your well-being to be able to bring out a more extroverted state. And that's not necessarily changing your trait extroversion. It's not changing what you're like in general. It's just saying, in this particular moment, I have a goal where bringing out a certain personality state, I think, is going to be helpful for one type of well-being or another. And if you can bring that out successfully, then that'll probably help you achieve your goal. If you can't bring it out, they may be really frustrating and it may be a source of negative emotion or ill-being. So I think in a lot of ways, figuring out how to be flexible in these personality states is probably an important process for reaching sort of all of our well-being goals, whether those are hedonic, like feeling pleasure, or eudaimonic, like having meaning or accomplishment or a sense of personal growth.
Well, when you talk about sometimes, like, if we very certain goals, I may want to be a little bit outgoing or a little bit laid back, but sometimes people may, I guess, that struggle because due to lack of skills or because the mindset is saying that, oh, I'm not quite sure whether I can do this, I can't do that. So during that kind of states, what would be your suggestions for people who think that I actually don't have that skills or maybe don't have that motivations, even though I want to? I mean, like there's a gap. So what sort of things that people can do in that circumstances, if it makes sense?
Yeah, so I would say from a scientific perspective, I don't know yet. So the research isn't
It's
there
really a
yet
scientist, yes. Everything is scientific.
actually testing this stuff. So I mean, I'd say what the research shows so far, what we have fairly high confidence in, is that when we use experience sampling to study people's states, basically everybody in the samples of these studies tends to show a wide variety of states. So if you think that you're somebody who doesn't change, you're probably wrong based on the data, right? You might actually change more than you think. Whether you can control that and actually do it on purpose is another question. And we don't know why there would be gaps, right? So what I'm finding in my research is that people have this diverse range of goals for what sides of their personality they want to bring out. A next step is showing, okay, well, how often do those goals translate into actual behavior? So there would be some situations where I want to be extroverted right now and I'm successful at that. And other situations where I want to be extroverted right now and I'm unsuccessful at that. And one of the things we need to sort of figure out is, why would that gap happen? Is it because, like you said, a lack of skill, right? Are there certain skills to being extroverted that would make it really easy? Are there certain emotion regulation strategies like reappraisal or situation selection that might help. Are beliefs important, right? So if you tend to believe that your personality is more fixed versus more flexible or changeable, what role does that play? So I think we have a lot to learn about what explains those gaps and to sort of figure out what the interventions might be. As a starting point, I would sort of look to the research on emotion regulation, which really says, well, look, if you change the way you're thinking about the situation, or if you change something about the situation that you're in, that might be helpful. So for example, if you you might reflect on, when are times when my extroverted self has tended to come out in the past naturally, right? So if each one of us does have those times occasionally where, you know, even without trying to do it on purpose, our extroverted side came out, we could ask ourselves, what was it about those situations that made me feel comfortable doing that? And then if I have a particular situation in the future where I want to be more extroverted, can I replicate that, right? You know, maybe it's that I have to watch a funny show beforehand to like boost my mood, or I have to bring, maybe there's a certain person in my life who tends to bring out that side of myself. And so maybe I need to like bring them with me or have a chat with them or something like that. But this is all speculation at this stage.
Of course, and I guess based on my personal experience, obviously, I've been doing a series of these Science of Your Wellbeing interviews. As I mentioned earlier, I tend to be more an introvert, but then when it comes to doing the interview, I've chosen to step up with more extroversions, understanding that I want to have an informal chat with people like you or the interviewers, and want to create a more relaxing environment. And therefore, I realized that I also need to be intentionally to step up and not for myself. And that over time has become, I'm not quite sure whether it is something that is fixed or not, but certainly it does help me to improve my levels of confidence of communicating. But yet at the same time, I also know that after the interview, I can always go back to my men's and say, okay, I need to relax for a while, recharge a little bit more.
For sure. And I did a quick 10 minutes of exercise before the call myself, because I know sometimes my neurotic side comes out sometimes in these kinds of interviews or conversations, or I get a bit tense, I get a bit nervous. And I know that if I've exercised, that tends to be less of an issue. So that's something that I've noticed in myself. Whether research would bear that out as an effective strategy for everybody, I don't know. But certainly for me, I've noticed, okay, if I do a little bit of exercise before an important meeting or conversation, I tend to be calmer, and it tends to go a little bit better.
Brilliant. All right. Because you've been spending a lot of time studying personality psychology, so I'm wondering, how can personality psychology help inform how we design and use well-being interventions?
Yeah, thanks for this question. We actually just published a paper on this, a sort of personality-informed approach to designing interventions. And I think really the key thing is recognizing that the problem that you're trying to solve with an intervention depends in part on the nature of the person whose behavior or well-being you're trying to influence, right? So there might be some kinds of well-being interventions that work well for everybody. I would think that those are relatively few and far between. Instead, I think, you know, the kinds of well-being interventions that are going to work are going to depend on a particular person at a particular place in time. So if we can use personality to understand what are a person's needs and what are their preferences and what are their values. So for example, if somebody doesn't really value pleasure very highly, then trying to get them to do well-being interventions that maximize their mood is probably, I mean, it might be okay, it might be helpful, but they're not going to care about it as much, and therefore they're probably going to be less likely to stick with it. You know, if they value meaning, for example, then finding meaning boosting interventions might be more effective. And people like Sonia Lyubomirsky and Kristen Leos have written about sort of the importance of person activity fit in positive interventions in the past. And I think we're sort of building on that work and saying, like, look, if you want to change behavior, personality psychology has a lot to offer. And it's sort of a rich research discipline, because really personality psychology tries to study how do people tend to behave and what explains why they tend to behave that way. yeah, I think it's a really useful discipline if you want to work on interventions.
Yeah. All right. So at a practical level, would it be too extreme fast track to say that, look, does it mean that if you want to design a well-being intervention for an individual, that person need to undertake some sort of personality test or assessment in order for me to have a better understanding? Or it's more informal kind of conversation, get an idea?
I think it depends a lot on the context in which you're, designing the intervention. So let's say you're a clinical practitioner or a coach and you're working one-on-one with somebody, then you could do some kind of personality assessment, either a survey-based questionnaire or their interview protocols or things like that, to actually measure somebody's personality traits and see if that gives you useful information about that particular individual. Other times we're using interventions in more sort of group context, right? So we're trying to design a well-being intervention for an entire workforce or a community or something like that. And there it's a little bit harder because you can't really tailor things to the individual, but you might be able to, we talk about this in the paper, you might be able to know some things about the general disposition of the group. So for example, let's say the group is a group of healthcare workers. We talk about this example of a study by Adam Grant and Dave Hoffman, where they were designing an intervention. It was not a well-being intervention, it was a hand washing intervention. So they wanted to get healthcare workers to wash their hands more often after going to the bathroom because it creates problems in hospitals. And if you think about it, healthcare workers, we know something about their personality. So even though each healthcare worker differs to some extent from the next one, we know that in general, for somebody to choose to go into the profession of healthcare, they probably care about helping other people. So they probably have pro-social personality traits and they probably value helping other people to a large extent. And so what they did in this intervention was they put up signs in the bathroom, and one of the signs said, wash your hands, it'll keep you from getting sick. And then the other sign said, wash your hands, it'll keep your patients from getting sick. And what they predicted was that the patient-focused sign would work better because we know that healthcare workers, especially when they're at work in a hospital environment, are thinking about, they're going to tend to thinking about how can I help other people. And so all of a sudden, if you connect this behavior, washing your hands, with this thing that we know about the personality of this group in general, then we can design a more effective intervention. So I would say if you're working on a well-being intervention with a group of people, well, what bonds that group of people together? And is there something you can know, right? Like, are they very achievement oriented, right? Maybe they've come together because they're a group of high achieving students or, whatever it is that connects that group together. Maybe you can learn something about the likely personality characteristics of the group in general that can still help you tailor the intervention a bit.
That's good. So I guess that we sort of going back to the basics that when it comes to designing the well-being intervention, it's not one size fits all. We heard that a lot often, and it just again being mindful that there will be variations. When the more we understand whether it's individual, whether it's a group, a team, organizations, then we'll be able to design a more personalized, tailor-made, effective, sustainable interventions. And you talk about the person activity fit. So I think that's also again one of the very useful tool to find out what will be the best fit for the, again, individual, teams, organizations.
For sure. And I'd say keep in mind that people can change, right? And they likely will. So if you're working with people over time, don't assume that the intervention that was effective and right for them at the beginning will be the same intervention that is effective and right for them, 6 months in or a year on, or even a few weeks later. It might be that we actually need to design interventions that adapt with the person as they change. So it's not just tailoring to the person at one point in time, but tailoring the intervention to the person as they go through a potential change and transformation process.
Yeah. So it's not design and forget kind of approach. You need to constantly monitoring, understanding, adapting, and changing based on circumstances. That's good. That's good. Again, I know that we had talked about these questions earlier on, but I just want to sort of bring all together. There's always a debate. Once again, we're talking about whether our personality is fixed or whether it can change for a lifetime. But you propose that it's more helpful to think of personality as a set of defaults. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. So I mean, the research evidence shows that personality can change, and I think it helps to think about personality change at these two levels of traits and states, right?
Yeah.
So states I talked about before change a lot, right? So your person, how extroverted you are might change a fair bit from one moment to the next, and you'll go from being extremely introverted to extremely extroverted at different times over the course of a week or 2 weeks. So those states change a lot, and that's something we need to keep in mind. Traits can change too. So there's a lot of research to show that there's some natural change in development of traits over time. So as people age, they tend to become a little bit more agreeable, a little bit more conscientious. There's a lot of theories and hypotheses about why that is, but it's not all sort of pinned down yet, but there is clearly some change in people's traits over time. There's also sometimes change in people's personality before or after big life events, right? So when you get or lose a job, or when you get married or something like that. So change happens. There's also growing interest in whether change is possible on purpose, right? So can people intentionally try to change their personality traits? And I would say there's some modest evidence to say yes, but it depends a little bit on what you mean by personality and what's actually changing, and there's more work to be done there. And so I've started thinking about personality really as kind of your default mode, right? So your default is what you're likely to do, given no other input, right? So like by default, I'm going to tend to be moderately extroverted, pretty conscientious, a little bit neurotic, fairly agreeable, right? Those kinds of things. That's like my default mode that I tend to be in a lot of the time. But sometimes I'm not in that default mode, right? Sometimes I've had bad sleep and I'm crankier than usual, right? Or sometimes I'm really particularly motivated by an achievement goal and conscientiousness like shoots way up and everything else shoots way down. So your default is what you're gonna be like most of the time, but we can opt out of that default both in the moment, right? Because there's a particular situational demand or goal that's important to us. And we might be able to change that default over time, right? So as we age or as we try to change aspects of who we are, then what our default is can change. So that's why I think it's useful to really think about personality as a default, because in the moment it really captures this idea of, well, this is what I'm going to tend to be like by default most of the time. But if the situation changes or if my goals change, well, then I might act a little bit differently than that default, because the default isn't hard coded. And over the long haul, right, I might be able to change, my default might change, either because my life has changed or because I've tried to change myself in some way. And that's a little bit of a different thing, but it still reflects the idea of defaults are pretty strong, right? People tend to act in accordance with their defaults most of the time, but they're not totally fixed, right? We can change them from moment to moment and potentially over time.
So sounds like the key message here is again that as mentioned earlier, we all have our personality defaults, in the sense a tendency to think, feel, behave in certain way, but yet at the same time, there's always room for regulations, rooms to actually to change depending to the goals that we want to accomplish, depending to the circumstances. And I'm not sure how relevant is this. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's almost not sure to what extent the growth mindset, fixed mindset kind of play into these so-called changes of behavior as well, and personality. I may sidetrack you a little bit more, but it's just something that popped into my head.
For sure. There has been some research on that, right? So whether people, a lot of the work on fixed versus growth mindset was really about intelligence, right? But it's also to some extent about personality, right? And some people really, within personality psychology, treat intelligence as an aspect of personality. So it's really that idea of well, do I think that I am one way and never changing, or do I think that I can potentially change? That might be important. And I think to make it really concrete, you were talking before about it sounds like your default is to be fairly introverted, right? So a lot of the time, if you have a choice between a more introverted activity and a more extroverted activity, your default is going to be to choose the more introverted one a lot of the time and tend to act that way. But sometimes, you're going to have these projects come along that you're like, hey, I really think this would be a good thing to do. And I'm going to do these interviews. And so in those particular moments, you're going to ignore your default and you're going to do something a little bit different because it's meaningful to you. It serves some sort of goal or value that you have. And it may be that by the time you get to the end of doing all of these interviews, that you realize, actually, maybe your default has changed a little bit. Maybe you still overall are fairly introverted, but now that you've done this enough times and had practice with it and realized that you like doing it, maybe actually your default is now a little bit more mixed and you sort of switch back and forth between choosing the more introverted thing and choosing the more extroverted thing. Or maybe your default will just stay, you still have this really strong preference for being an introvert most of the time, but now the next time you have a project idea come up that requires a bit of extroversion, you can switch into that mode when you need to.
Excellent summary there. Thank you so much, Reb. Only have one last question for you. Got nothing to do about personality psychology. I'm just curious, what is one thing that you have been doing this week to look after your well-being?
Good question. Probably not enough, to be honest, because I'm in the sort of big rush to going on vacation next week. So I'm trying to get a lot done, but I have been trying to make sure I get a bit of exercise in each day, so that I don't just stay sitting on the computer for too many hours on end.
Yeah, great. Exercise, one of the key elements to enhance your well-being. Great. Well, I'm afraid that is all the time that we have for today. Once again, thank you for joining us, Reb. And if you want to engage Reb's expertise in how we can design well-being interventions using a personality-informed approach, you can certainly visit his website. It's rebrebele.com. It's REBREBELE.com. Thank you for watching. I'm Demus from Strength Optimizers. We are here to bring out the best in you by optimizing your strengths. Have a fabulous day, everyone. Once again, thank you, Reb. Goodbye.